Thanks, everybody, and welcome to today's webinar hosted by auDA and the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. I'm Rosemary Sinclair, the CEO of auDA, and it's my absolute pleasure to introduce the webinar to you. I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which I'm coming to you from today, the original home of the Wurundjeri peoples of the Kulin Nation. And I'd like to pay my respects to elders past and present. I also acknowledge Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first people to innovate and use technology on this land, and to do so over many millennia, knowledge upon which we build today. The previous announcement reminded you that the session is being recorded. We're really pleased to be joining with the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre to bring you today's discussion on the 2023-2030 Australian Cybersecurity Strategy. The strategy, which was released in November 23, is the roadmap through which the government has set out to achieve its vision of becoming a world leader in cybersecurity by 2030. Cybersecurity and resilience significantly contribute to the overall health and well-being of the digital ecosystem, on which we all rely increasingly for our social, community, and economic well-being, if you like, our digital lives. Let me now introduce our speakers. Firstly, Rachel Falk, who will be moderating the conversation. Rachel's the CEO of the Cybersecurity CRC and was a member of the Australian Government's Expert Advisory Board, appointed by the Minister for Home Affairs to advise the government on Australia's cybersecurity strategy, the strategy that we're going to be focusing on today. Also joining the conversation is Hamish Hansford, Deputy Secretary of the Cyber and Infrastructure Security Group of the Department of Home Affairs and the Acting National Cybersecurity Coordinator. And also Brendan Dowling, Australia's Cyber and Critical Technology Ambassador and previously First Assistant Secretary of the Cyber and Critical Technology Coordination Centre in the Department of Home Affairs. All three have played key roles in the development of Australia's cybersecurity strategy. We would welcome your discussion after the conversation between our three panellists. Please put them into the Zoom Q&A tab and we'll take it from there. For now, Rachel, over to you.
Thank you, Rosemary, and welcome everyone to our fireside chat, as it were, on the Cybersecurity Strategy 2023 to 2030. So, as Rosemary mentioned, I'm joined by Hamish Hansford and Brendan Dowling, and both of whom were key in the drafting and formulation of the strategy and have been on the long journey. I got off the journey in June last year, but perhaps I'll start with, I was on the expert advisory panel with both Andy Penn, the former CEO of Telstra, and Mel Hutfeld, former Chief of Air Force. And we were welcomed warmly by our colleagues over in Home Affairs. But it was an ambitious strategy. I think it's the first 7-year cybersecurity strategy I'd ever seen, and we were set a very ambitious timetable by the Minister. There were over 300 submissions. I'm sure probably Hamish knows exactly how many submissions there were, but over 300 submissions. There was the Minister placed a huge emphasis on public consultation and really wanted a wide-ranging cross-section of society to contribute, and they did. It was impressive, the effort that companies went to give us submissions on virtually everything we mentioned in the discussion paper and more. We sometimes got lots of other advice and guidance that we hadn't expected. But it was very interesting to see how it developed. And for me, it was a great privilege to work alongside Andy and Mel, and also with Home Affairs in helping formulate various aspects of the strategy. I was looking at the regulatory reform package and what that potentially meant around the impact of some of Australia's legislation and cyber security or cyber risk issues. And there are various lines of effort. I'm not quite sure what's happened to Brendan. He might have jumped off inadvertently.
Just lost connection. He's coming back on.
That's quite timely. So I'll throw to you, Hamish. Perhaps we can have a bit of a chat about. Obviously, you've been far closer. I left a while ago. The minister was very ambitious, a 7-year plan. Let's have a chat about, what was behind the 7 years? Why wasn't it the standard kind of 2 years that we've seen in the past?
Well, I think that the minister was really looking to have an aspirational goal. And as you said, she set the challenge of how do we be a global leader? And we don't think we can do that in 2 years. And so 2030, even though it's 7 years away, it feels very close for that really lofty ambition. And I think the government was looking on the back of Optus and Medibank to say, how does Australia actually be a global leader? And that's why 7 years was effectively chosen.
Yes, sorry, there's a bug crawling off my screen. Exactly. And do you think, to what extent do you think that environment, if we cast our minds back, she announced the strategy in December 2022. It was off the back of the Optus and Medibank cyber breaches, which were significant and the largest breaches I think we'd ever seen in Australia. How much do you think that formed her thinking as to making an ambitious sort of agenda?
Well, I think the very first thing that formed the minister's thinking was having a cabinet level minister for cybersecurity. And the very first briefings we had with Minister O'Neill was, how do we co-design our future? How do we think about things in a different way? And then you're right, Rachel, Optus, Medibank come along. And I think that really grabbed the public attention, industry attention. And the 333 submissions we received for the discussion paper is actually the most insightful submissions I think we've seen. And I was reflecting the other day that in 2009, we were talking about the internet connected ICT, and haven't we advanced so much since our first cyber security strategy in Australia? But I really think that they're formulaic in terms of exercises, the establishment of a coordinator, and you see that peppered throughout the strategy, that really the response to Optus and Medibank in there.
Yeah, definitely. And Brendan, I know you've joined us again, so thank you. Obviously, you were the first assistant secretary at the time. You were leading the show. How do you think in terms of the 333 community submissions that we received over that time, what was the level of engagement that you sort of saw as opposed to others? And I know you've been involved in the past. From your perspective, what was the level of engagement from our stakeholders?
I think really, really strong, and as Hamish says, quite insightful. I think when we embarked on that engagement and consultation process, there was a question in our minds whether we were coming back too soon, having done the 2020 strategy only a couple of years earlier. We are conscious, even though it might not always seem this way, of being over consultative, of hitting up the same people for the same views again and again. And I think a conversation we had within the Department of Home Affairs at the time was, well, will people feel that they already told us their views only sort of 18 months to 2 years before? Why are we coming and asking for it again? And actually, that's not at all what the sense was. There was a strong sense that things had moved along enough. We all knew more about what some of the challenges and issues were. So I think people really actually got behind the idea that there was a degree of urgency and that there was a need to refresh the strategy to look forward in that longer term way. And I think the level of engagement, not just through the submissions, but through the extensive face-to-face and virtual consultations that we did, was a really strong sense that actually the vision of being a world-leading cybersecurity nation was something that people supported and agreed with, but a really strong sense in Australia, but also through the region, that we hadn't got things right, that we're still on a journey, we're still trying to improve, and actually the threat environment, the scale of digitalisation, creating the much wider attack surface, meant there was a strong degree of urgency to try and embed a whole-of-nation approach.
Yeah, thank you for that. One thing I wanted to touch on, which was a key theme that came up in every roundtable we did in every aspect of this, was small business and cybersecurity, SME cybersecurity, and obviously auDA being a small business, this is topical, even though they're critical infrastructure. And the same with the cybersecurity CRC. Small business, it's a challenge. And we got some pretty unvarnished feedback as when we were doing that. And I think many of the in-person roundtables we went to, people really were very, very passionate about this and wanting to know how is this strategy going to be any different to the ones that had come before it? I mean, what's your sense of that now, having sort of landed the strategy? Hamish.
Well, I think the first thing we learned for small business, I think over the last couple of strategies, is there's no smoking gun, there's no silver bullet. And actually the mix of different initiatives in the strategy, whether it's bolstering out cyber.gov.au with resources, creating a ransomware playbook, investing in cyber wardens to really get industry to speak to industry and mimic what fire wardens do in the cyberspace, or building out support through Treasury is I think, the mix of initiatives. It's also something the Executive Cyber Council, really representing big business and cyber industry representatives, are thinking about how do we use our pulling power to make the contact with small business that they have through accountants, through big business, through telcos, through banks. How do we all get in the fight? And I really think co-design of those options are really at the hallmark of what the implementation of the strategy will be, in addition to the initiatives that you see in the action plan, and again, a 2-year action plan.
Thanks. Brendan, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'd add the point. I think it comes through in the strategy that there is a degree of frustration, I think, at how hard it is for small to medium enterprises. I think what Hamish has run through is critical in terms of what government can do to convene and drive some energy to provide small to medium businesses with that assistance. But I think a real sense of frustration, in which we've tried to articulate in terms of expectations on the technology industry through the strategy, is that it shouldn't be this hard. You shouldn't buy software, then have to configure it in a way that makes you more cyber secure. You shouldn't buy software and then have to pay a premium for add-on products to get to a basic level of security. So I think one of the other key messages for us is directed at the global tech industry, including major enterprise software providers. The notion of security by design, that products that they sell should have security as a core feature, and security by default. Essentially, we need to make it easy as possible for people to turn on MFA, to activate those sort of security features. We even see it today, and I don't want to pick on sort of any particular company, but I will. We see it with Microsoft offering premium security products as add-ons, where people have to buy more instead of built into core products. So hopefully that message also came through in the strategy.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. I think that's right. And the concept that, security should be embedded in. It's not a nice to have anymore. And I think there's an impatience now in the community about that. And that's right. I just want to, if I can, turn to some of the major cyber incidents we mentioned before. Optus and Medibank played a huge role last year. We also saw Latitude Financial. We've had DP World, and unfortunately, the list goes on. And they had a major impact on the community, particularly Optus and Medibank, September, October 2022. Major impact on, I think, with the new government, the minister expressing very public frustration about what she thought the legislation, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act, could and couldn't do. And of course, we've all spent a bit of time looking at that and unpacking that and seeing where improvements could be made at all. But it certainly, I think, has impacted how organisations see cyber, and with critical infrastructure providers now having legislative requirements to have risk management plans and especially systems of national security. Hamish, if I could just ask you, in your role with CSC engagement and the cyber community, how do you think has that engagement changed since sort of those 4 or 5 big breaches? And what's your sense of engagement in the community post those cyber incidents?
Yeah, definitely. And actually, you mentioned the risk management program. I think those incidents, the risk management program, has really got boards and CEOs to step up and say, what would happen if this happened to me? And I'm seeing so many different companies think about the data they hold and why they hold it and the economic benefit for holding it versus the risk. And I'm hearing examples of companies that are shredding 95% of their data or putting it into a deep, highly encrypted archive that's not easily accessible. So I think that's driving change. And I see it in exercises where people are stepping up saying, actually, we really want to exercise this with you because we don't want to have the first conversation in an actual cyber incident. And then I'm seeing investment in risk management just generally, because when I talk to consultants, the cyber industry, company CEOs and boards, they're all thinking about cybersecurity and security generally. And I'm seeing such a massive investment in it. I'd like to think it's the risk management programs playing a part, bringing those CEOs and boards into play. But I think the environment is fundamentally changed.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you. I think it's a very different environment now. It was very tough to get cybersecurity on the sort of board agenda sort of 5 or 6 years ago in a significant way. And I think now, no doubt it is on and should be on every agenda of every board meeting, both large and small organisations. Brendan, if I can throw to you, is there a feeling at a global level that Australia is sort of taking more of a leadership role? We talked about this being the cybersecurity strategy that was both domestic and international. And I know, when we had our consultations, there was a lot of feedback. But what's your sense of that out with Australia and the leadership role it's taking?
Yeah, I absolutely do think that it's a strong sense out there. And I think SOCI is a really good example of that. When the SOCI reforms were passed in Australia, they were seen as somewhat controversial, quite world-leading, quite intrusive from some industries' perspective. I think we're now seeing some of the core elements of SOCI starting to form a baseline in terms of global critical infrastructure protection. I spend a lot of my job traveling through Southeast Asia, other parts of Asia and the Pacific. And the second or third question that I get asked all the time is about how we've gone about implementing SOCI and protecting our critical infrastructure. And people are wanting to learn from our approach because, unfortunately, they're learning the hard way that their critical infrastructure is vulnerable and exposed, and they're seeing attacks happen on a daily basis, whether it's cybercrime, whether it's nation-state actors. And there's a real level of interest in what Australia has learned from our experience. We try to promote some of the core ideas at the heart of SOCI. I think the risk management plans is a really powerful idea because it's not about government prescribing, here are the things you should do. It's about saying, here are the risks. Now, you as a critical infrastructure operator need to figure out the right way to mitigate those risks. The other thing I really emphasize is how Australia has engaged heavily with industry in a kind of team-based approach to how we understand the threats and how we mitigate that. So I say to countries in the region, if you're looking at our example, the first two things you should look at are a risk management approach and convening industry to have those conversations about the threat environment, about what they're seeing, and about that sort of exercising to be prepared for what comes next. So I think we are seen as quite a strong example of how to take this seriously.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Brendan. And now, Rosemary, obviously auDA is critical infrastructure, and there's a new consultation underway as well. Perhaps if you can talk to us about the steps that auDA you do to keep a trusted domain and what security means for you at auDA and the domain space.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Rachel. And let me first start by explaining why we're critical infrastructure to people on the webinar. And just a few stats that we use to try to quantify this. For example, the .au domain name system receives on average 103,000 DNS queries per second from people all around the world accessing Australian business websites or sending emails. We're now amongst the top 10 globally of top-level domains and amongst the top 7 country code top-level domains. So we play, those numbers represent a role that we play similar to what Brendan was alluding to, a role of global leadership in terms of the practice, if you like, of cybersecurity for a critical infrastructure owner, operator. So the way we do it, we start with international best practice cybersecurity standards rather than making it up as we go along. We go looking to see what are the highest thresholds that we can find internationally, and we work towards those. Not only do we work towards those, and this is a critical point, I think, for an interconnected economy, the one that we have now, we have to work with our partners to make sure that their cybersecurity performance is where we need it to be. So we have adopted those standards ourselves, but we implement them through contracts with our registry operator and our registrars. And we require those channel partners to operate at similar standards. We also do a lot of work in chasing DNS abuse cases. This is our way into the small business cybersecurity conversation. What we see is that the problem is old software on business websites. So this issue of how we get small business to engage, but secondly, how we actually get Service Channel to support them properly. We've got one of the lowest levels of domain name abuse in the world, but it's work we do every day with Australian small businesses. So those are some of the sorts of things that we're doing in a really practical sense to make our contribution to cybersecurity and resilience for .au.
Thanks, Rosemary. It's a very practical but a really important part of the internet governance world, and that's why a .com.au website and is important because of that. It's trusted, and that having spent some time at auDA, I certainly know that the links they go to keep it trusted and secure. So thank you for that. We've got a new consultation paper out, which was released, I think, in December on the legislative reforms that came out of the strategy. It's obviously addresses lots of very important potential legislative reforms. And some of those were actually discussion paper questions, and then they're further on for consultation. Hamish, if you could perhaps outline the very innovative points raised in the discussion paper and consultation paper, and what they hope to address, and what you think, without preempting anything with government, of course, what legislative approaches might be taken or what the outcomes could be, because it's quite wide-ranging, and it's sort of different it covers a great breadth of legislation and new initiatives.
Certainly does. And we asked, you asked some pretty provocative questions in the discussion paper, like, should we ban the payment of a ransom? Should there be a broad-based cybersecurity standard across the economy? We had really mixed answers from people, and what the government's landed on is a mix of 9 different measures, which actually think about how do you co-design a future that regulates at the highest level of aggregation, knowing that we've got a Privacy Act reform, which effectively with APP 11, Privacy Principle 11, sets a baseline cyber standard for the economy. With our critical infrastructure law, puts our most important infrastructure in a good place, and then seeks to amend the infrastructure law, really to look at connectivity with data systems, particularly looking at things like Colonial Pipeline, where the ICT attack then led to the shutdown of an operational technology pipeline. Things like actually having the ability to manage the secondary consequences from a crisis, not just a technical response to a cyber incident. Thinking about how do we more freely share information between industry, given the Critical Infrastructure Act has some prohibitions there. How do we actually give more enforcement and remedy powers to people who are not thinking about risk management in a way that is appropriate, and of course bringing the telecommunications provisions from Part 14 of the Tel Act into SOCI as a holistic response. That's really the infrastructure side. And then on the whole of economy side, Brendan's touched on Internet of Things devices. So actually, just like the Europeans, the UK, by executive order, the US are doing, looking at a secure by design standard for IoT devices to actually make sure the technology that we rely on is secure by design. We tried in 2020 to do a technological supply chain paper, but objectively, we think that hasn't had the right impact. looking at ransomware reporting to build up both the intervention point with industry to think about how do you respond to a ransom attack perhaps in a different way, i.e. by not paying a ransom. And then if you do, actually building up that information about the volume of ransom reports in Australia, actually encouraging people to report to the ASD and the coordinator and putting a limited use provision around that reporting. And then finally, looking at very much the Homeland Security Cyber Safety Board and looking at that concept. And I know, Rachel, you love the theoretical concept of transport safety, really having a cyber incident review board that looks at cyber issues for whole of economy, lessons learned and transparency. So that's what the government's landed on to consult with industry. And we've still got 11 days, I think, till industry consultation closes. On not 11 days, because I think it's a leap year, isn't it? So I think it's only 9. Actually.
That's right. That's right. It is an ambitious reform agenda and very wide-ranging. I don't think I've seen one that is so wide-ranging and ambitious. And there was lots in there. I know there was lots of feedback in the discussion paper about many of those points as well. Just on the limited use provision, do you think, because I think it is important that everyone understands what that is and why, did you want to just touch on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. I think, and there's a question that goes to the level of reporting into the Signals Directorate in the chat, which is that there has been an increase in infrastructure reporting in the last year from 95 to 143. But their hypothesis is that actually the quality of reporting and given the volume of increase in cybercrime, they'd expect to see more. And really, I think that gets to having government do two different functions. One is how do you support a cyber incident and how do you roll out the cyber fire truck, if you like, both from the coordinator and from ASD's perspective? And then how do you separate that from the regulatory function of government? So limited use effectively says, if you share information with ASD for a technical response or with the coordinator for a consequence management or a whole of incident response, that would never be used then for other actions like regulatory action. So it's really saying to industry and to individuals subject to a cyber incident, government can do two competing things at the same time, but we will never use information that's provided for technical response or response mechanisms in a regulatory investigation. Now, I don't think that would happen anyway, but there is certainly a perception out there that it could.
Thank you. And I know that, and again, it's really important that organisations do engage with ASD without fear that they need to hold back. So that's important. Brendan, if I could just pivot to you for a second and ask, how does SOCI compare with respect to other sort of international approaches and whether Australia is really leading this space with this kind of legislation?
Yeah, I think we're starting to see the adoption of similar types of standards in a number of other jurisdictions. But if you compare us to the United States, for example, we are blessed with a more agile regulatory environment. So it means that we can adopt a major legislative reform like SOCI only a couple of years ago and then come back and make the kind of tweaks and improvements that Hamish is talking about. I think you look at the US, as is widely reported, they're often having to find provisions in existing acts, sometimes from decades or a century ago, that give them the regulatory powers to drive the type of uplift that we're trying to do here. So they're imperfect models. I think we're in a much better place in having this type of agile regulatory environment. I would say there's a constant debate in our region as to whether you need to go down a legislative reform path or whether encouragement of industry to adopt these sort of standards or a more voluntary approach is sufficient. I think using the IoT example that Hamish mentioned, I think increasingly countries are seeing that voluntary measures have not worked with IoT. We're seeing Singapore and the UK go down a regulatory pathway. I think we'll see a similar thing elsewhere. I think around SOCI, some countries are trying to have that sort of voluntary approach with their critical infrastructure operators, but are coming to the same realization we have, which is that with this sense of urgency, with the threats that we're seeing, and with the huge uplift required, voluntary and hoping and encouragement is just not going to get us there in the timeframes that we need to. We can see that companies and CISOs around the nation and around the region will say to us, you know, I can't get the backing of my board. I can't get the backing of my CEO. I need something that's a little bit stronger than kind words encouraging. I need a stronger stick if we're going to drive this. And I think, look, we'd love to, you know, we do tend to, while we are agile in a regulatory sense here, it's not our first option. It usually is the last resort. But I think we're in a situation where hoping over a sort of 10 to 20 year period that we'll see these type of improvements is just not going to happen, and it's not going to happen quick enough. And I think we'll see a lot of countries in the region get to a similar approach, that the vulnerabilities are real and present. The threats are happening now. Hoping and praying is just not going to get us there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're right, voluntary often doesn't get us there either, hence the, you know, SOCI is really world leading. I know we've got NIS and other frameworks across the EU, but SOCI and the tweaks we're making, well, the government is making, are key, I think, to helping shape a stronger regulatory environment, which hopefully will mean a more secure cybersecurity environment for everyone, including supply chains and smaller ones. If I can just throw to the international element a bit on this, you know, when we started our work as the EAB, and we had the consultations minister, Tim Watts was very much a part of the discussions that we had, and it was very much an international strategy as we developed it. Brendan, if you could just talk about the importance of Shield 6 and what it meant for international engagement, because this is the first time we'd had a combined strategy. They had tended to be separated out. If you could talk us through that, and what do you think the benefit was for Australia having it as just one strategy, but in engagement, international engagement and outreach?
Sure. Look, for me, it was really important that they were integrated, because there is a seamless story in terms of Australia's national security and our place in the world. As an example, I think the sort of standards for technology that we're using in Australia, most of those technologies are developed in a global market. It's not enough to say that in Australia we have certain standards and we want people and companies to meet them. We need to advocate for that globally in global tech markets. So there's a seamless line from what Hamish tries to do in terms of protecting Australia's national resilience, and what I try to do in getting out there into global discussions, working with other countries, working directly with the global tech industry on advocating for the adoption of those standards and baseline security globally. I think we also realised that the strongest card that we have to play in our international engagement is the story that we have in Australia. It's a story of SOCI, it's a story of our other cybersecurity reforms. As we talk to countries globally, we don't want to talk in an abstract way. We want to say, here's what Australia's done, here's why it's useful and potentially something you could learn from. And I think finally, cyber is a borderless issue. It's a global, international issue. We cannot talk about Australia's national cyber resilience without talking about the global threat environment. And core to that is our deterrence posture. That means we are out there advocating for states to behave responsibly in cyberspace. We're using UN and other multilateral forums to reinforce the norms which say you don't attack another nation's critical infrastructure. It means that we're advocating for countries to adopt a stronger posture against cyber criminals. The more countries that take seriously the risk of cybercrime, develop their own digital forensics capability, their own law enforcement capability, makes the world harder for cyber criminals and makes it harder for them to target Australia. So I think when we look back in hindsight, it actually makes complete sense to have the international component integrated into the strategy, because it is a seamless single story that we're trying to tell to protect our national interests, which is tied in with regional and global interests for cybersecurity.
Great, thanks. And if I might throw to Rosemary now, perhaps Rosemary, you can comment on what the work auDA does to support and engage with the regional and global multi-stakeholder community. And what is this? What is it? What do you do, and what does it mean?
Yeah. So it's really a key part of our work. So security, stability and reliability of .au is a core focus for us, but also promoting and championing policy work. And the way that works globally is through the multi-stakeholder internet governance processes. Those processes are not a set and forget way of doing things, and from time to time some governments want all of this to come under government control. We've taken a very strong position through our internet governance roadmap to say that that's not the best way. The best way is for the technical community and the broader academic and research community to remain engaged in these discussions about how the internet is governed. And so those discussions need to be genuinely inclusive. So that has taken us into our region recently with a focus on trying to engage more voices and have those voices represented in the discussion directly, not through mediation of any sort, but directly in the room, so to speak. And we're looking for a genuinely inclusive conversation that prioritises public benefit and meets the needs of stakeholders across the regions, all the regions, not just in the developed world. It's an ongoing conversation. The next year is actually going to be quite pivotal. There are some really important discussions happening at the United Nations around the Global Digital Compact and the 20-year review of the World Summit on the Information Society. So it's key focus for us over the next 12 to 18 months.
Thanks, Rosemary. That's really helpful and important to know the role auDA plays, but also that we are sort of keeping an eye on, potential geopolitical shifts and, as you say, some jurisdictions wanting internet to come under government control, which is a significant issue in the region, but for the internet more generally, and who gets what information and who has access to information is important. So thank you. If I can just turn to, obviously, recently the government did a joint cyber-related attribution and sanctions on a Russian who was behind the Medibank private hack, Alexander Ermakov. And he was named for the first time Australia used their cyber sanctions. He was named and photograph published and named as one of the key cyber criminals behind the Medibank private attack. And I think I'll ask both of you, Brendan and Hamish, about what this meant and why this was pivotal. I think from my perspective, it was the first time we had done that. What did it mean? Well, he was never going to be brought to Australia to face a trial. We don't have an extradition treaty with Russia, where I believe he currently resides. We do have 39 bilateral extradition agreements with other jurisdictions. So what that means is if he travels to one of those and Australia gets wind of it, he could potentially be extradited. But my understanding is also there was asset freezing of any relevant assets in the UK and the US. So there is a little bit of a pain for him individually. My understanding too is he would not have liked to have been doxxed in the way he was. He was named and shamed. And it may well have been that could have sort of stunted his career growth. But there are many Alexander Ermakovs. He's one. He's not just the one in that jurisdiction. There are many. Brendan, if I can first go to you, and if you can just talk about the sort of process of joint attribution and why did the Australian government want to call him out, knowing there was sort of, it wasn't going to undo the harm that he was involved in. But what purpose does it serve to use cyber sanctions and do it the way we did it?
Sure. Look, and a great sort of overview of how we got there and what it means, Rachel. I think we've all had a gutful that cyber criminals are effectively operating with impunity globally. It's such an extraordinarily lucrative industry, and largely cyber criminals get away with it. They make a lot of money. They're operating from jurisdictions like Russia, where we don't see effective law enforcement. And it's hard to see how that business model gets broken over the next little while. For us, this sanction is a tool that we have at our disposal. As you say, traditional law enforcement, prosecution, arrest is pretty challenging when we have an uncooperative jurisdiction. That doesn't mean it's out of the question and not something that our federal police will continue to pursue against Ermakov and any other actors that might have been involved in that incident. But the sanctions are a really powerful tool to say, we know who you are, there are costs, there are consequences. By the UK and the US also sanctioning Ermakov, that is a real consequence in terms of his ability to deal in global financial assets, his ability to travel elsewhere, as you say. So there is a real cost to him. And I think importantly, the doxing is a huge part of it. Cyber criminals rely on operating anonymously. This is not just embarrassing for him. I think it makes it very difficult for him to ply his trade. I think it exposes him to further monitoring and law enforcement by other jurisdictions. So this is a big deal in terms of his ability to operate as a cyber criminal. For me, the really crucial thing is that we're doing something. We're imposing a cost and we're saying, if you target Australia, don't assume you can get away with it and maintain your anonymity and impunity. There will be consequences. The whole idea being, how can we deter cyber criminals from actually plying their trade? There are, it's a complex, lucrative ecosystem of cybercrime, but these things do have an effect, and we'll look to use the sanctions regime more in the future to continue to have that deterrent effect on others.
Thank you. That's a great summary, Brendan. I think at the time the Deputy Prime Minister said anonymity is his and the cyber criminals' calling card. And that day, the Australian government was removing his ability to remain anonymous in the calling card. Hamish, perhaps if you could just touch on how Home Affairs works with partners at a global level with respect to obviously cyber sanctions, but things like the Ransomware Action Task Force as well.
Yeah, sure. And thankfully, it's not reciprocal with Russia, given they've personally sanctioned me. So thank God I'm not going to travel to Russia anytime soon. And Mr. Ermakov certainly won't travel here. We are operating together with Brendan internationally. And you mentioned the counter-ransomware initiative, which really gets to the heart of the issue that there's no single thing that will resolve cyber security. It's going to be a whole mix of things like sanctions. Australia's taken a leadership role in the counter-ransomware initiative because we think, to be a global leader, that we need to be at the forefront of working with like-minded countries on ransomware issues. And so we lead together with Lithuania, the counter-ransomware task force, thinking about what are the operational responses to countering ransomware. How do we actually build up a whole bunch of partners, some of whom we collaborate with pretty regularly, like the Five Eyes on critical infrastructure and cyber issues. Others, we're forming new partnerships, and countries like Lithuania, some of the Nordic countries, Singapore are all our partners in that forum under the leadership overall of the US. And I think that's what it's going to really take to make a difference on cybersecurity in the future, working with different people, trying new things, where we fail, kind of learning and recalibrating. And that's really what the counter-ransomware initiative is all about.
Thank you. That's really helpful and really good information to know. And Lithuania, I didn't know that. So helpful.
Partners against crime, that's what they are.
Great. Thank you. We've got some questions coming in from obviously our audience. If I can throw one for all of you, I'll start with Rosemary and then Hamish and then Brendan. This year is the year of the election, with globally up to 4 billion people expected to vote. From a cyber perspective, what do you see as being the biggest threats and things that we need to keep in mind, Rosemary?
When we think about these kind of major incidents, we really keep an eye, Rachel, on the registration of domain names to make sure that registrations are within our rules. We have different levels of responses, but we play an active role in making sure that the integrity of .au remains strong and very high during these periods. Elections are one example. There are other global events, and very unhappily, the fraudsters and criminals in the global community take the opportunity around the globe to cause trouble. So we'll be on high alert in terms of the integrity of .au.
Great, thank you. That's terrific. Hamish.
Well, we lead the domestic counter foreign interference mission here, and together with partners, we're really looking at electoral interference issues, have a range of partners to shore up Australian elections, particularly thinking about how do we create electoral commissions, how do we make sure they're secure, how do we actually think and look for signs of foreign interference, working with ASIO, AFP and different partners. And then internationally, again, a bit like the counter ransomware initiative, bringing a group of like-minded countries together to think about how do we secure elections, how do we think about foreign interference, transnational regression, how do we actually shore up our democracies. And I think ultimately it's going to be a whole of society effort to have much more informed people, particularly when online issues happen, and to actually get the Australian public and other publics across the world, with the billions of people going to elections this year, to think much more critically. And I think that's going to be a generational shift and change.
And particularly, I think that's right, with raising awareness of the population as to key threats. But it can be very tricky. All it takes is one slight murmur of some transport being down or some cyber attack somewhere to throw people off and to cause chaos on an election day, which I think is, you could see happening in some jurisdictions. Brendan, what do you think? I mean, obviously beyond Australia, in the region and other places, what do you think it means for?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you kind of hit one of the key points there, Rachel, in that this can come in a myriad of ways. Electoral infrastructure in terms of voting machines and tallying processes could be targeted. It could be the mis or disinformation issue where you have false information put out there in at a very pivotal time in an electoral cycle. It could be the hack and leak sort of operation that we saw in the American election in 2016, where political parties are targeted, information stolen and put out there. So there's a range of ways in which actors can undermine democracy, undermine electoral processes. I think there's a real consciousness of it in the region. It gets raised with me by partners in the region all the time. They're interested in the work that Australia's done, that Hamish just described. I think in our region, there are many countries which are precarious democracies. I think one of our assets in Australia is that there is trust in the electoral process. I think there's many countries in the region where that trust is much more precarious, so they are vulnerable to that type of attack. I think the key thing that we emphasise is the importance of seeing electoral processes and institution as critical national infrastructure, as core, needing to be protected, investing in that security of the actual digital technology that might be used, informing the public about some of those risks. But we also send a very clear message, and we said this through the strategy, in terms of nation-state actors, electoral processes and institutions are the reddest of red lines in terms of foreign interference by cyber means. It's absolutely unacceptable under international law and according to all norms of responsible state behaviour for a foreign government to interfere with the democratic processes of another nation. Unfortunately, this is not a risk. It's not something that's theoretical. It's something that we are seeing happening. We will and are seeing it happen this year as we see those elections happen. I think the important thing when it does happen is that we call it out and we try to introduce a degree of state accountability for that behaviour, which undermines the very faith in those types of processes.
That's really important. And Rosemary, perhaps if you could sort of tell me or talk to us a bit about the position, the leadership position that auDA is taking with respect to this.
Sorry, Rachel, in terms of election?
Regionally, yes, rather than just Australia in this year.
Yeah, so it has really become clear to us through a range of different work that we're doing, participating in global discussions. We're doing an interesting piece of work thinking about future scenarios trying to really challenge complacency and to imagine and stretch ourselves, what's become really clear to us is that we're not going to fix the cybersecurity or indeed cyber resilience issue by just focusing in Australia. We need to have deep and meaningful relationships with people in our region and be engaged in global processes. So what we've been doing for the last 18 months or so is really thinking about how we could work regionally with our counterparts. And when we started doing that thinking, we saw that there was a lot of terrific effort in addressing the communications connectivity issue in the Pacific. So cables, satellites, all sorts of efforts going on. There's some absolutely fascinating work being done around digital transformation of economies and communities in really quite small states. But in the middle there are the protocols and effort of country code top-level domain managers who play this kind of middle role of enabling digital transformation and sitting on top of the communications capability. So when we started talking to our peers about what we are doing in .au around cybersecurity, technical resilience, reliability, and so on, it started a really interesting conversation. And it's a conversation that's going to go on for some time to come. But we really see that we have the privilege, if you like, of being able to make a contribution beyond what we are doing here in Australia to assist our neighbours in the region to achieve the same sort of cybersecurity and cyber resilience standards that will help their communities, but will also help .au users.
Yeah, thanks, Rosemary. It's very important too that the region is stable and secure, and that you're sharing your expertise across the region, vitally important. So thank you. A question from the chat. It is a bit of a meaty and thorny question, so I'll summarise it a bit, and then I'm conscious of time, so a few minutes. There is, a few years ago, there was a lot of concern internationally about the difficulty of attribution, but in recent times we've seen some takedowns by Five Eyes partners. Has the process of attribution become easier or changed, or what's led to sort of probably more public attribution and takedowns than there have been in the past? Hamish?
So really, I think attributions and the different approaches that we've taken really form one element. The other element that's kind of hidden in the cybersecurity strategy, and we outed our offensive capability in, I think, 2016 for the first time. And you see investment. So you see Project Aquila or Operation Aquila and the funding for the federal police really go to the heart of an investigatory capability. And then when you see kind of attributions happen, a lot of that relates to the operational activity that's underway by Five Eyes partners. And you're right, we have had an increase, I think, objectively, Brendan, in the last couple of, I think, months actually, about attribution. And we are seeing countries like the Five Eyes together and European partners coming together and actually calling out bad behaviour. And I think that was kind of difficult historically, but is coming more and more regular as part of our suite of tools for attribution and calling out action.
Thanks, and I would agree. Yeah, you're right. There was one I saw the other day, I can't remember, where it was a site takedown with all the badges of numerous law enforcement across the globe. So does that mean more cops on the beat, or has there been a different approach, Brendan?
I think attribution is really hard. And I think, the Medibank situation, that took 18 months of concerted effort to identify that actor. I think in many respects, attribution is actually getting harder. Nation states are more sophisticated. We're also seeing a broader range of players in the kind of cyber world with the commercial proliferation of vulnerabilities and exploits and tools. So I think it's actually going to become more difficult to make those types of attributions. But I think from the Australian government's perspective, we see it as crucial. The couple of things that make it really compelling for me to do that increasing level of attribution that Hamish just mentioned is when we're talking to Australian industry, we need to be able to tell them, here's what's happening and here's why this is really important. We don't want them to wait for an attack. We don't want them to sort of guess that maybe there's some bad guys out there that they need to worry about. We need to give them specific information. A good example is the technical advisory about Volt Typhoon that was issued about 2 weeks ago, which gave some detailed technical advice of a Chinese state group targeting critical infrastructure as led by the US. I think we'll continue to see more of that. For me, it's super important for my work in the region to say, we're not just kind of, running around saying the sky's falling in. Here's the reality of some of the threats that we're facing. And we trust you enough to share this information with you. It's not something that we just keep to ourselves. It's important to air that, increase that awareness, shape the perception of these issues so that it drives the behavior behind it. So I think you will see an increasing number, an increasing regularity of attributions, which reflects the sort of scale and severity of the cyber incidents that we're seeing.
Great, thanks very much. And you're absolutely right. It is a difficult job, hard to do, attribution, and lots of effort across sort of the ASD and AFP and others. Look, we're almost right on time. Thank you so much, my fellow fireside chatting people. I'll hand back to Rosemary to now close out this fireside chat.
Thanks very much, Rachel. And I thought that was a great note to finish a really important conversation, which has been about communications, cooperation, and building confidence, if you like, amongst the ecosystem of people interested in cybersecurity and cyber resilience. So I'd just like to thank our experts, Hamish and Brendan, today for your contributions, and to you, Rachel, and the Cybersecurity Cooperative Research Centre. Thanks so much for your role and assistance in bringing together today's events. We'll be having future events, of course, and to hear about these first, please join us, become an auDA member. It's a very easy process. Have a look on our website, a free membership for people who are passionate about the internet. We're going to be hosting a cybersecurity workshop ourselves on the 28th of February with Cinch Security. And then after the next ICANN meeting, which is meeting number 79, towards the end of March, we'll be hosting a readout webinar on that event for members of the community interested in internet governance. All the details are on our website, so please check them out. Thanks again, everybody, for your time and interest in this topic this afternoon. Have a great day. Bye-bye.